Welcome back. French President Emmanuel Macron is on a mission to mend relations with Algeria. Relations between the two nations haven't been good since Algeria's bloody war of independence. Paris is hoping that the relations will resurrect trade in oil and gas reserves. Joining us is Professor Frank Gerits, a research fellow at the University of the Free State, South Africa, and assistant professor in the history of international relations at Utrecht University. Thank you so much for joining us. Very good evening to you. Thank you for your time. Just last month, before we perhaps touch and expand on Algeria, we know that French President Emmanuel Macron concluded his visits to Cameroon, Benin and Guinea-Bissau. At first glance, I mean, just looking at his choice of countries, it's almost very difficult to understand. We're speaking about 3 former French colonies and a former Portuguese colony. They seem very different, don't they?
Yes, I mean, and they are. I also actually struggle a little bit with trying to understand why Macron chose these different countries. But I think there is a logic to it, and that logic can be found in Mali, where the French are being kicked out. They had a huge presence there since 2013 in trying to manage a terrorist threat in the country. And now Macron is looking for new partners as the French are drawing out. And it's interesting to see, right, that the choice for these 2 French former colonies, Benin, Cameroon, that sort of makes sense, right? That is sort of a classic visit that French presidents do, where they sort of try and rekindle a relationship, exploit the interests they have, and in Macron's case, trying to sort of get a position to sort of manage the situation in the Sahel. What is interesting is, as you said, is his visit to Guinea-Bissau, a former Portuguese colony. And that visit is, I think you have to understand that visit in the context of the regional situation. Guinea-Bissau is president of ECOWAS at this point, an important member of ECOWAS. And ECOWAS, its main sort of focus is trying to manage that situation in the Sahel. So ECOWAS and France actually have similar interests in the region. And I think Macron is trying to sort of do some terrorism management on the cheap.
He's also on a mission to mend relations with Algeria, and perhaps we should talk about the position that France has taken when it comes to adjusting to the contemporary demands of apologies and reparations and restitution.
I mean, it's a very interesting time we're living in, right? I mean, I think only about 5-6 years ago, when European leaders would go and visit the African continent or different African countries, the story would always be, yes, we've done some things that weren't really right, but we should forget this and turn the page. Now, European leaders, and I mean, I can also think about the recent Belgian visit to the Congo, they all start with apologies about the colonial past, a very overt sort of effort to even set up historical commissions with historians that then have to sort of write or rewrite colonial history, to then sort of trying to have that as a basis to then mend the relationship. Macron did this in Cameroon, a very bloody a war for independence. He said, well, we're going to set up a commission of historians that are going to write this sort of colonial history. And in Benin, he did something similar. He sort of visited the museum where art that had been robbed in the colonial era had been returned. And now in Algeria, he also announced the establishment of a joint historical commission of 6 Algerians, 6 French historians who are supposedly going to write a history of the colonial era in Algeria, which I think is an effort that is a little bit difficult to do. I mean, I think the example of Algeria is an interesting one. There is a lot of history already about Algeria. We know so much about the Algerian War. There's so many books out there, and also books for a general public. So it isn't really clear to me what this commission is supposed to be doing, right? I'm very, very skeptical of this sort of overt effort to pay historians to supposedly write a history that has already been written. And on top of that, those commissions are going to be marked by conflict because the narrative that Macron is really trying to push here when it comes to Algeria and these African colonies is that there is some sort of shared history there, that colonialism wasn't really the right thing to do, but there is sort of an even relationship where we can sort of mend that relationship. And I'm not certain that is going to be the outcome of these histories.
And in evaluating the politics of it, the political tone, what's in it for France? I mean, what we've seen within the visits is the effort to maintain some form of influence.
Yes, I mean, and I don't really think Macron has a clear vision about what he really wants to achieve. I think it's a lot of it is trying to maintain a relationship that is collapsing. I mean, the direct interest obviously is security, right? This is sort of security management in the Western African region. And then, well, an increase of investment. He always talks about the youth. He always, in all these countries, right? Not only in Algeria, but also in all these other countries that he visited, he has a similar story, right? He targets the youth of Africa with focusing on technology, sort of technology startups that then have to create some sort of prosperity, I assume. He sort of talks about mending the colonial past, and then he talks about security. And I think, I mean, in the short term, the security relationship is really, really important, because with the Algeria story, I was actually waiting a little bit for it, and then it popped up. It popped up in his last press conference with the Algerian president. Then they explicitly said, yes, we for the first time in history, we had a meeting not only with presidents about security, but also with the army staff, also with people who are sort of in the security establishment of both countries. So I think the security management is really the short-term interest, and then the longer-term view is trying to, well, maintain a stake in Africa, also sort of trying to sort of correct some of the mistakes that previous French presidents have made in being very overt about why they were interested in Africa.
Because rectifying the colonial past is something that is quite significant, especially looking at what we've seen with the return of the tooth of Patrice Lumumba, with Belgium making that move.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, that effort, or that sort of symbolic gesture, more than a symbolic gesture, right? The return of well, what is left of Patrice Lumumba. So Patrice Lumumba was violently assassinated in 1960, and the people who assassinated him, with Belgian support, sort of dissolved his body in acid, and all that is then left, or what the Belgian police found, was a tooth that belongs to the first Prime Minister of Congo. The return of that sort of that artifact to Congo is immensely significant, of course, for the Congo itself. And I mean, I think for the whole of Africa, right? The return of African independence fighters, or the remains of African independence fighters, is incredibly important. The politics behind it are a little bit more cynical, I think. I mean, I think by recognizing, or sort of overtly putting out there that European countries committed colonial crimes, a lot of these countries, like Belgium, take an argument out of the hands of the Russians, of the Chinese, who then when they arrive in Africa say, we never colonized you. So it is a way to try and buy some goodwill, and then try and maintain some influence. So there is this contradiction here, right? There is this willingness to deal with colonialism of the past and maybe establish some sort of colonial influence in the future. There's this interesting contradiction going on in African international history at this point in time.
Yeah, and with the renewed interest on the continent, how does France now stand out from, like, the U.S. and separating itself from the U.S. and Belgium when it comes to going in and trying to revive a relationship here?
I mean, I think it's definitely sort of its continuous reliance on culture. It's sort of reliance on doing cultural exchanges in sport, in the arts. This is something that other leaders don't do, right? Secretary of State of the U.S., Blinken, visited different countries, visited South Africa, but he didn't set up sort of a cultural exchange program. The way France sort of tries and distinguishes itself from other countries is by really investing in culture, in funding startups for youth, for young people, in sponsoring the arts. A really great example of this is his visit today in Algeria to a music studio that is famous for the disco Maghreb, which is a sort of hybrid Algerian French sort of independent type of disco music that became very popular again. And he goes and visits, right? He goes and visits this music studio to sort of emphasize over and over again, we appreciate African culture, and we actually also think that we actually can have a relationship with that culture, and also have some French connection with the different cultural activities that are happening on the continent, which is historically speaking very interesting because it's something the French have always done. If you go into the archives, they more than any other country invest in these cultural relationships, and that's really how France tries and distinguish itself from other countries.
Yeah, and perhaps the perceptions that France wants to continue, especially looking at the history books and what has come out of mending relations then.
Yeah, I mean, I think, as I said before, I think this whole effort to rewrite history, I think, is a very faulty way of going about doing this. There is a lot of history already out there, and on top of this, I don't think Macron really understands anti-colonial nationalism as it developed in the 50s, 60s, 70s, or 80s, because he still talks about this sort of continued relationship between France and Africa. He still talks about, I mean, he visited, like, look what he visited today, right? He visited the Disco Maghreb, which is this Algerian cultural, powerhouse. And then he also went to sort of a fortress that is sort of built and rebuilt by French Christians. He goes to a Christian cemetery to pay respects to French Algerian, or to the French soldiers that died in the Algerian War, and then he also goes to lays a wreath with the monument for Algerian freedom fighters. But that is not how you, I mean, in my opinion, that is not how you write a decent history of what happened in the anti-colonial struggle. It's a sort of continued effort to sort of keep on saying, well, colonialism had its bad sides, but there are also upsides, and now we have to sort of come up with this relationship. That's why I think these commissions are not going to end up somewhere. So that the French perception of colonial history is very, very different from the African perception, and I think the African perception is the right one.
Very well. Thank you so much. Thanks for weighing in on this discussion. University of the Free State Research Fellow and Assistant Professor at the University in the Netherlands, Frank Gerits, speaking there about France's mission to go and visit some countries across the continent. Still to